It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful to you for coming out. And someone perhaps will be watching this since it's recorded, and I'm grateful to them for tuning in. I'm going to talk today about education, and Jane's just said in her introduction a couple of things which kind of feel misleading. The distinguished bit, I think the more I do philosophy, the more I realise I'm wrong about, and therefore the less distinguished I feel. But we'll let that pass. And who would refuse a medal? And the other thing that I don't typically engage with issues about education. My central research focus in everything I do is about human goodness. It's about goodness. It's about human goodness, and it's about goodness in the world. And it's about how to make transferable the ability to engage with those goods in the world, with value around us. And I guess that means that I have a full-time, permanent commitment to thinking about issues in education. And certainly, I want to know what Meno affects to want to know at the beginning of the dialogue of that name, Plato's Meno, which is the third item on the handout today. Are you able to tell me, Socrates, whether virtue is teachable? Or if it isn't teachable, is it a habit that we get by practice? Or if it's neither learned nor got by practice, does it come to humans by nature? Or by race? Or in some other way? I added something to that, the bit about race. Because for every society, throughout history, the question of whether virtue is teachable, whether, as I put it a minute ago, goodness in the world and human goodness in response to that goodness, whether that is something that just happens by chance, or something that happens by picking up a habit, by imitation perhaps, or whether it's something that you have by nature, that question never goes away. And I put in the bit about race, of course, because there now unfortunately seem to be people, not primarily in Wales, I'm glad to say, but certainly in general, who think that race is somehow a guarantee either of goodness or of badness. And the book I'm writing at the moment is about Augustine. And I already know, if anyone here is on Facebook, you'll see me ranting about a number of things. One of the things I've been ranting about recently is precisely Augustine's tribalism. And the philosophy editor at CUP came to me and said, she'd come to me before and said, write a book about friendship, Sophie Grace. And I said, okay, Hilary, and wrote a book about friendship, which was enormous fun. And some people seemed to like it. So Hilary came to me again and said, write a book about Augustine, Sophie Grace. And I said, okay. And after all, I started off when I was 29 by writing a PhD about Augustine and Aristotle. So why not have another look? And the book title is Why Read Augustine Today? And I got stuck trying to write it because I sort of inferred from the title that I had to find nice things to say about Augustine. And the more I read him this time round, the more I reread him in some cases and read him for the first time in others, the more I disliked him. And actually, I think dislike can be a reason for reading someone too. It can be important to read someone to see why they're so wrong. And that's why in a world where racism is on the rise, it's not such a bad idea, even, dare I say it, I wouldn't be allowed to say this in Germany, to read Mein Kampf, to see what it is that you're up against when people come out with these hateful ideas, to go into them and see to the bottom of them. And in most cases, they're pretty shallow, and it's not very hard to see to the bottom. That's certainly true with Mein Kampf. But with Augustine, it's much deeper, because he's a great philosopher and a great thinker and a great person. I mean great there almost in the magnitude sense. He is an extraordinary personality. But his tribalism is a thing I hate about him, expressed above all in his view, which I think is the root of many evils, that human beings are made, some of them, to be sent to heaven, no argument, they're predestined for heaven, and others are made by God to be sent, no argument, by predestination to hell. I think that is the most vicious form of tribalism imaginable. And so my book is turning rapidly into a rant about Augustine and what's wrong with him, and I mustn't get too distracted by this. I'm going to frame all this as a missed opportunity, I think. It could have been so much better than that, especially given, I think, where Christianity comes from in the Gospels. It could have been so much better than that on Augustine, oh dear, tribalism. So, can virtue be taught, or do we get it by nature? If we got it by nature, would it be something that we just picked up by being the right sort of people in one sense or another, being part of the elect, being part of the wonderful Welsh people, or wonderful whatever people, or by being just rich and well provided for by mummy and daddy? Can virtue be taught? That was the question I started on this paper with. And by the way, if it's any comfort, I intend to stop at 1920, 1925, or thereabouts. That's a time, not a year. So you don't have too much of this to put up with. But I wrote a book about epiphanies because it came to seem to me that one of the main ways in which moral education happens is by epiphanic experience. People see something that has a wow factor. And there are perhaps two kinds of epiphanies, the wow experiences and the aha experiences. So most people know about Archimedes in his bathtub discovering that you can measure volume by displacement because he realizes his own body in the bathtub is displacing water. And that's a kind of intellectual epiphany, if you like. That's a kind of aha moment, a light bulb moment. There are also, and my book Epiphanies focuses on them, wow moments, moments where you are overwhelmed by the beauty or wonder or magnificence of something in front of you. Okay, if that's how moral education happens, and we needn't say it's the only way moral education happens, let's just suppose it's an important way that moral education happens. Sidebar, there's a thing I call the curse of the definite article, and philosophers are always doing it. Philosophers ask what is the meaning of life, and the word the seduces them into thinking there has to be just one. Or philosophers say, what is the reason why murder is wrong? And the word the seduces them into thinking that there's just one, and they don't even notice they're doing it, but they assume that there's just one answer to what is the reason why murder is wrong. So I could do that here and it would be a mistake here too. What is the means by which moral education happens? If I was that kind of reckless theorizer, I may be several kinds of reckless theorizer, but I'm not that kind. But if I was that kind, I'd say, oh, the way in which moral education happens is epiphanies. I don't want to be that reckless. I just say that epiphanies are a way, an important way, that moral education happens. End of sidebar. So, if we're going to talk about epiphanies and whether they can be taught, whether they can be transferred, not by chance, not by accident, not by shared wealth or something, not by merely the grace of the gods, which is another alternative that Meno and Socrates both take seriously in Plato's dialogue. If epiphanies are a means of moral education, then that education had better be transferable in some sense. It should be possible that epiphanies can be taught. You'd hope so. I haven't presented an argument to show that, or even to suggest how they might be possible yet, but that's the business of this paper. Can epiphanies be taught? Too Long Didn't Read version. Yes, they can be taught. And poems are one way of teaching them. And that's why the first item on the handout is the poem by Edward Thomas, Adelstrop. Socrates was wrong. The best way to define anything is by example. You should use examples in defining things. Socrates famously refuses to, in the Meno and in other places. He refuses to start from examples. And yet, as so often with Socrates, that's his official position, and his official position is over here. And there's Socrates' practice, which is way over here, because actually he uses examples all the time. So you think, can he really mean it when he says, don't teach by example? Well, I think in some sense he does really mean it, yes. And yet he's always using them, so there's something paradoxical going on. And I'm just going to cut through the paradox and say that his anti-definition by examples statements are wrong. The best way, and I will risk a there, the best way to define anything is to begin with an example. I want to define epiphany, and here I am telling you 10 minutes in that we've reached the beginning. Never mind. So let's start with Adelstrop. Yes, I remember Adelstrop. The name, because one afternoon of heat, the express train drew up there unwontedly. It was late June. The steam hissed. Someone cleared his throat. No one left, and no one came on the bare platform. What I saw was Adelstrop, only the name, and willows, willow herb and grass, and meadowsweet, and haycocks dry, no whit less still and lonely fair than the high cloudlets in the sky. And for that minute, a blackbird sang, close by, and round him, mistier, farther and farther, all the birds of Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire. I'm going to do a little contextualizing of the poem now. It's about a humdrum and familiar experience, the unexpected halt in the middle of a fast train journey at an empty rural station. I came here from Edinburgh today on the train, and there were several of these events, and unfortunately, I'm sad to report, I wrote a poem about none of them. The train journey, we know the actual date. It was the 24th of June, 1914. He was travelling from Paddington to Malvern, and I imagine some literary critic who's also a train buff has got out Bradshaw's, the traditional railway timetable, and actually looked that up. So they could even tell you what time it got to, well, what time it should have passed through Adelstrop. The village of Adelstrop lies just in the county of Gloucester, but very close to the border with Oxfordshire. And the station was, of course, closed in the Beeching Cuts in 1966. But the Paddington to Hereford line still runs past its site, and I've been down that line myself and seen the sign, which still says Adelstrop, or did when I passed. When an express train just stops in the middle of nowhere, the natural response is vague, mild annoyance. What's going on? Why have we stopped? How long will we be here? Why would a fast train like this one stop at an obscure village station like that? But Edward Thomas, his response is deeper and less banal. He's enchanted by the moment, in the unexpected pause created by the relative quiet, and the momentary relative lack of coal and steam smells that allows him to sniff the roses, literally. He grasps perspective on things that opens out from this little place where he finds himself to encompass an entire pastoral. Here is rural England in midsummer, Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire together, their very names a kind of gentle spell, and what an achievement, by the way, to find a rhyme for Gloucestershire. And the brightening morning sunlight burning off the night's cool dew in the warming heavens that are opening up above him, this transient glimpse of an abiding loveliness, is exactly what I mean by epiphany. Now, it isn't just Socrates who is wrong, Derrida's wrong too, because Derrida says il n'y a pas d'autre texte, and at the risk of being chased from the room by Derrida scholars who are going to tell me that I'm misinterpreting him in what I'm about to say, I'll say it anyway. Understanding the context of what Edward Thomas says here is essential to understanding the poem itself. Edward Thomas was born in 1878 and died in 1917. He was a literary critic. He was, I don't know who he wrote for, but London Review of Books kind of thing, who then became a poet as well. He wrote Adelstrop in the winter of 2014 to 2015. So he was looking back on an experience from the summer. He was born in Lambeth to Welsh parents, and like his clear poetic predecessor, George Meredith, I think Adlestrop's a bit like the lark ascending an epitome, the poem, not the music. He regarded himself as essentially Welsh rather than English. He spent as much time as possible in Wales, and his 3 children, all born in the southeast of England, in Kent or Hampshire, he called them Merfyn, Bronwen and Myfanwy. It's perhaps not coincidental that the village of Adlestrop is not only in the border between an English home county, Oxfordshire, and an English West Country county, Gloucestershire, it's also fairly accurately halfway between London and Wales. Underlying the poem is a certain kind of hiraeth, a certain kind of longing, for what another London Welsh poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins, once called the lovable West. When Thomas wrote this poem, moreover, he was thinking about enlisting himself. So he wrote the poem before the First World War started in June 2014. Sorry, he experienced the poem. He had the experience the poem's about in June 2014. He wrote the poem in December 2014, after the war had started, and he was thinking about enlisting himself. And here's a sidebar factoid that you may care to regale your friends with in pubs. I'm sure they'll be thrilled. The Road Not Taken, a well-known poem by Robert Frost, much calendarised, can I say, much treated as a source of deep folk wisdom. It's the poem that ends, I took the road less taken, and oh, what that has made a difference to me. What a difference has made to me. How does it go? Something like that. Now, that poem was actually written by Robert Frost to tease Edward Thomas. They were friends, and the point of the poem is not calendar block wisdom. It's not rather sentimental uplift, as it's often taken. The point is to take the piss out of Edward Thomas for being a hesitating person, someone who wasn't definite in what he chose to do. So Edward Thomas was the first person to read The Road Not Taken. And he was perhaps the first person to misunderstand it too, because he thought it wasn't just about his hesitancy in general, but in particular about his hesitation over joining up. And he was so offended by Robert Frost's joke that he did join up. You could thus say that The Road Not Taken has been a lethal poem on at least one occasion, because unfortunately Edward Thomas died the moment he reached the front line. Again and again in the trenches came the moments of mutual recognition between enlisters from every county in Britain and Ireland. In that wartime context, the names Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire attain a certain kind of nostalgic resonance. Both are the names of important regiments of squaddies. And among the things that two soldiers having the "where are you from" conversation, when they just arrived in the trenches, one of the things they might well say, you can easily imagine them saying it, is, "Yes, I remember Adlestrop." So the poem starts with the squaddie's line. So I've been rather exact about the background to Adlestrop, because without the detail of the background, we can't see or understand what the poem is. It works by having a context. This is the exact opposite of Il n'y a pas de text. This is saying that to grasp the poem, you need to understand the context in which it's written. And I've said something, maybe too much, maybe too little, about what the context is. We can't grasp Adlestrop any more than we can grasp Titian's paintings without knowing Ovid's Metamorphoses. For most of Titian's paintings, you need to know your Ovid. And for a surprising amount of Shakespeare, actually, it really helps to know your Ovid. And Dante too. The background's metaphysically crucial. The location of Adlestrop in time, in place, and in the part happy, part sad narrative of Edward Thomas's truncated life. That all determines the identity conditions of the experience that it records. And this embeddedness in context shows us something more general, how epiphanies are both objective and subjective. An epiphany is a moment in which we come into contact with something out there, something real and objective. In the teeth of scientific prejudice, we should insist that not only science, but poetry too, limns the contours of reality, tries to sketch out, tries to grasp and portray what is there in the real world. The gentle, mysterious pastoral beauty that confronted Thomas was a quality of the world as he found it. It wasn't merely the quality of his finding it. It was both. Indeed, if you will, yet an epiphany is both a texture of the world, something objective, and also something subjective, the texture of our experience. It's the way the world is, but we can't experience the world that way unless we ourselves are a certain way. I hope that's enough to give you some grasp of what an epiphany is, and I hope it helps you to make sense of this particular example of an epiphany, namely Edward Thomas's poem. Let me add to that the second item on your handout, which is my definition from the book Epiphanies of what an epiphany is. And I hope it's reasonably obvious how Adlestrop fits this broad pattern. An epiphany is an overwhelming, existentially significant manifestation of value in experience, often sudden and surprising, which feeds the psyche, which feels like it comes from outside. It's something given, which teaches us something new. It takes us out of ourselves, and there's a natural and correct response to that experience, at least one and possibly more. Often the correct response is love, often pity or creativity. An epiphany might be an angry epiphany, or it might be a moment of reverence or awe. It might be a moment of hunger to put things right. When Nietzsche famously put his arms around the neck of the carriage horse, perhaps he was experiencing a kind of hunger to put things right. It seems to be a kind of awareness of the animal's subjectivity that made Nietzsche do that. It can be a hunger for justice that we feel in an epiphany, or it can be many other things. An epiphany can be something that leads directly to action or new knowledge. It might also be something that prompts further contemplation, or it might be something that brings about other responses again. In all these ways, I'm saying there are paradigm epiphanies, paradigm cases of epiphanies, really good examples, like what Adlestrop is saying, describing, and there are ways of moving away, gradations away from those paradigm cases. So we have something rather different from what you often get in philosophy, particularly analytic philosophy, which is nothing counts as an X unless ABC, and also anything that is ABC must be an X. So necessary and sufficient conditions accounts of things. And then philosophers start with such an if and only if definition, and then other philosophers use it for target practice. And this can be an amusing game. It can be a good way to get a job in academic philosophy, and in a sense it's dead easy to play, because it's extremely hard to find an if and only if definition of anything interesting that doesn't have some exceptions, and therefore which is immune to target practice. Nietzsche once said that nothing with a history has an interesting, tight definition. And I think that's true. I think everything that interests us in ethics in particular tends to be grounded in the history of the human species and in other kinds of history too. And things that are historical tend to evade necessary and sufficient conditionship definitions. So I often go a different way with definition. I just look for paradigms. We're back to talking about examples here. I start from examples and I try to build outwards from them. What is sufficiently like this in ways that are interesting? Enough unity here to give us something to talk about. That's all I need. I don't need necessary and sufficient conditions. So we're asking Meno's question, can epiphanies be taught, with a variation, with the substitution of the word epiphanies for Meno's word, which was virtue. Meno asked, can virtue be taught? I'm asking, can epiphanies be taught? And the general form of the answer to that question is going to be the same, whether the question is, can epiphanies be taught? Or whether it's, can virtue be taught? Can epiphanies be taught, or do they come by habit or nature or luck, or the gift of divinity, or race? Is epiphany just something that comes to us because we're lucky enough to have a certain background? Is it in fact a matter of sheer luck? Or do epiphanies come by habit, education, inculcation of certain kinds of habit. And as you know already, I want to say that epiphanies can be taught. I want to say that epiphanies, the answer to my question is yes. Epiphanies are something that are transferable by rational means, or at least a capacity to be susceptible to epiphanies is transferable. And there's a central tension for me that I want to note, which is going to be in what I say for the remaining quarter of an hour, 20 minutes. And that central tension is this. I want to say that epiphanies are objective. They are of reality. They come from outside. In the words of the definition, they feel like they come from outside. There's something given relative to which we're passive perceivers. That's what I want to say, but I also want to say that they can be taught. Now, it's a mark of the difference between reality and illusion that reality doesn't behave. Reality goes its own way. And if we're lucky, that word again, if things go right, then good things happen in our contact with reality. But reality is resistant. It doesn't always go the way we want it to. This is the difference between reality and fantasy. We can make fantasy do whatever we like. We can shape our fantasies according to our wills. And our fantasies, I mean, there are limits on this too, but broadly speaking, our fantasies will be what we want. And often that's precisely what's wrong with fantasy and why we want to move from fantasy to reality. It's precisely because reality is not under our control. Think of friendship. Since I've recently been writing about that, think about friendship. We want the friend to be something better than a puppet or a mannequin completely under our control. This is a problem with AI friendship. It's a problem with sex dolls. It's a problem with imaginary friends of every kind, that they just do what we want them to and what we expect them to. Well, unless someone sticks a pin in the sex doll and it goes pfft, very deflating. Broadly speaking, they do what we want them to and no more than that. And they do what we can conceive of and no more than that. And they don't enlarge our world by being external to us, by being real and out there. And we want, all the time we have a deep instinct to be in contact with resistant reality. And a friendship is a good thing when it enlarges our world by showing us perspectives that we cannot see for ourselves, by making us think of things that wouldn't have come naturally to us. And this, I guess, is what Dr. Johnson was getting at with his famous refutation of Berkeley's idealism. So it isn't actually a refutation of Berkeley's idealism. Johnson misunderstood the theory, but set that aside. Johnson thought that Berkeley was saying that everything is just ideas, it's all in our heads, none of it's real, there's no external world, there's just whatever we fantasize about. And so Dr. Johnson famously said, I refute it thus, and stubbed his toe on a stone. Thus, incidentally, I fear, giving the green light to centuries of abuse of the word refute. But that's another story, and one which pedantic academic markers are always getting tied up in. But that aside, Johnson's point, I think, was precisely this, that reality is resistant and illusion is not. Dreams, they're in our heads, and they may go ways that we don't like, as when we have nightmares. But broadly speaking, the involvement of the will seems to us to be different in our fantasies. And we want contact with reality. So, if epiphanies are contact with reality, then they shouldn't be under our command. They shouldn't be there for our bidding. A real relationship with a friend is a relationship with someone who is not always under your bidding and always does what you want. That's not a friendship, that's puppet mastery. And we want epiphanies to be like that. But then if epiphanies aren't controllable in that kind of way, how can they be taught? Because teaching things involves controlling them. You can't pass on what you can't make a lesson plan about, what you can't fit onto a nice, neat handout. What is uncontrollable by you, it's not guaranteed that it's going to get across. There's luck involved. How can that be taught? One of Meno's opposites to virtue being teachable is the possibility that virtue comes to us merely by luck. And I see now I look at what I quoted, that option isn't actually in the options that Meno lists there at the beginning of the dialogue, but take my word for it, the option of virtue coming just by luck is certainly in the dialogue. It's in the last lines, for example. So we want to know how to teach virtue, and we want to know how to teach epiphanies in particular. So let me wind down by trying to say a little more precisely what I think is involved in teaching epiphanies, and to say something too about how an encounter with a poem can be learning an epiphany, and then qualify this by skipping right to the end where I quote Isaac Walton and where I talk about the art of catching fish. And I think there's an analogy here which I want to use for the question, can epiphanies be taught? And the analogy is this: can epiphanies be taught? That question is a bit like the question, can angling be taught? Which is what Isaac Walton's The Complete Angler is about. Angling can certainly be taught. Does that guarantee that any fish will actually come? No, it doesn't. But with a little bit of a following wind, with a little bit of luck, your skill and the circumstances around you in the world will hook up in such a way that you do get fish on your hook. And likewise with epiphanies, if you're the right kind of person, and if you're in the right kind of places, and if you have the right kind of aptitudes, then, although it's not guaranteed that epiphanies will come your way, there's a much higher chance. And that is my attempt to resolve the tension that I was talking about a minute ago, the tension between saying, look, epiphanies are objective. They're not just creatures of our heads. They're not just something that we can show to be merely an illusion within us, a subjective experience, because we can make them happen whenever we want. They're not like that. They are objective, and because they're objective, they're not subject fully to our control, but they are somewhat controllable in the sense that we can train ourselves in aptitudes to have them. That's where I'm going. And that's another slightly longer, too long, didn't read version of the whole lecture. So here are 6 ways in which epiphanies, 6 senses in which the answer to the question, can epiphanies be taught, is yes. The simplest sense, and the first sense I want to distinguish of these 6, is just that when you read a poem like Adlestrop, you are presented with Edward Thomas' experience. The poem narrates his epiphany. It tells us what happened to him. And in this simplest sense, reading the poem teaches us an epiphany simply by describing one. And that is a form of teaching people epiphanies. Describing epiphanies is a way of being taught them, just as having someone come into school and tell you what it's like to be a postmaster or a mountaineer or a school teacher or a philosopher in a university or a drag queen or whatever. Those are all ways of teaching people about, teaching pupils, students, about the world around them, simply by describing that possibility and pointing out that it's there. And this presumably is why the fascists are so terrified of drag queens. It's because the mere fact of them existing is already one way of learning. Shock horror to be a drag queen yourself. It puts them in the world. It puts them on the map as something we recognise. And so likewise here, this poem narrates Thomas's own epiphany, and that's the first sense in which we can be taught epiphanies. Just raising the possibility of them is a way of getting into people's awareness. Second sense, and it overlaps with the first sense a bit, the actual entails the possible. So the poem not only tells us that this thing happened to Edward Thomas, it also tells us how it happened to Thomas, what kind of subject he needed to be capable of having this experience. I've already said that he was enchanted by the moment, but good poetry shows, not tells, and Adlestrop is a very good poem. It's a poem about a gap, so it takes showing, not telling, this far. There's a thing that happens in that gap there, in the gap in the middle of the poem. That gap is the fulcrum and the centre of the poem between lines 8 and 9. In that gap, we go from a kind of deprecation of only the name. We go from something that's a faintly ridiculous moment, a banal moment. Adelstrop, perhaps it's a rather silly name. We're in the middle of nowhere, someone's clearing his throat, no one leaves and no one arrives. A phrase which is almost exactly quoted if you know the Flanders and Swan song, Slow Train. They're doing the ridiculous side, but they like this poem, Flanders and Swan, in that wonderful train, which I urge you to look up on YouTube. It's a lovely song. They're doing this thing too, of starting with something banal, seeming, ridiculous seeming, ordinary seeming, and opening out from it into a moment of epiphanic transcendence. Out of a slightly comic and awkward scene, silence arrives, and out of that silence there emerges something sublimely beautiful. And all that you need to grasp it is open eyes and ears. So we move from just knowing that this thing can happen, that's one way of being taught, to seeing how it happens, which the poem shows rather than telling, but it's there. So thirdly, Adelstrop teaches us Epiphany, or about Epiphany, by showing us that what happened to Ed Thomas, can happen to us too. And how would that happen? Well, one condition for that possibility is that we should be capable of being still and attentive, as Thomas is still and attentive. That's a learned capacity. We can begin to get at the heart of what's needed simply by saying, shut up and listen. The fourth and fifth ways that Adelstrop teaches us Epiphany is that what happened to him not only could happen to us too, it does happen to us, either because we have an experience like Thomas's own, or because we read Adelstrop, or both. So reading a poem like that can be a moment in which we meet something completely new to us. We haven't ever experienced anything like that, but here it is. Or it can be a moment of recognition, where we encounter Thomas's experience and we recognise it because we've experienced something like that. And so a respondent epiphany is created in us, the readers. And Philip Larkin's words are relevant here, at the top of the second page. The duty of the poet, Larkin says, is to the original experience. A poet's writing must be born of the tension between what he non-verbally feels and what can be got over in common word usage to someone who hasn't had his experience. So poems are portable epiphanies. This is a way of getting at the fourth and fifth senses in which poems can be ways of teaching epiphanies, and so epiphanies can be taught. Poems are portable epiphanies, meaning they're ways of making one person's epiphanic experience available to others. That's Larkin's point. That's what poems do. Some poems, sometimes, especially short lyrical ones like Adelstrop. This isn't another curse of the definite article case. I'm not saying this is the purpose of poetry. I don't need to. It's completely sufficient to say some poems do this. Not necessarily the rude, skittish bits of Don Juan, but that doesn't matter. There are lots of reasons why I might write a poem, or the lists in Homer. But this is what some poems do, and Adelstrop is a case. And Joseph Conrad says the same in the quotation I got from him. Sidebar here, precise philosophers will want to say, what do you mean, what does Larkin mean by the same experience? You say you're conveying the same experience to someone else. How can it possibly be the same experience? Why would you want it to be the same experience? Near me in Perthshire, there's a tourist attraction called the Macbeth Experience. And whenever I go past it, I think, so let's see, what are we trying for here? The experience of stabbing your king, or the experience of being hexed by witches and run through on the battlefield by is it Macduff? Whoever it is who kills him. Yes. Why would you try for that experience? But I don't want to worry too much about that. There is something which is the Macbeth experience, but not the Macbeth experience. One of those two uses of Macbeth was italicized. You want the experience that the play gives you. You probably don't want the 11th century battlefield experience. But there is something there that you want, and something that Shakespeare's play conveys, and it is somehow related to those events back in the the myths of Persia and the myths of time. And I'm not going to worry my head about that here, especially not when I've only got a couple of minutes left. My purpose here is just to raise possibilities, not to close them down. But I note, and I think it's an important worry and a legitimate worry, what do we mean by talking about the same experience in art? Maybe that will come up in conversation. But one more sense in which Adlestrop helps us to see how epiphanies can be taught, alongside becoming aware, first, that they happen, second, that they're possible for those who are disposed to write, thirdly, that we can be disposed to write, and becoming in character in these respects of his character, like Edward Thomas, is what we need. Becoming attentive people who have the kind of capacities that Iris Murdoch talks about in the third quotation on the handout. Becoming that kind of person is something you can learn, and becoming that kind of person is becoming someone for whom epiphanies are possible in a more than random way. You have dispositions, you have potentialities, you had negative capabilities, as John Keats famously called them in a letter, which you wouldn't have, which you are doing better than random if you are this kind of person. Your chances of having an epiphany are significantly raised. And there's a sixth sense in which Adlestrop shows by example how epiphany can be taught, and that is that you can learn yourself to be someone who does the kind of thing that Adlestrop does. You can learn yourself to be a poet. You can learn yourself to be someone who conveys that kind of experience, not only has it, but conveys it. And that, as Larkin was saying when I quoted him, is a matter of a tension between rigour and creativity of a kind that you get all over the place in all sorts of university studies, from physics and molecular biology and pure maths and applied maths, all the way across to the kind of things that I do, ethics, and sometimes kind of on the borders of classics or religious studies, or maybe even English literature. Creativity and rigour in combination, that's what it takes to be a good poet. And all of them, both creativity and rigour in the required sense are beyond all of us most of the time, but some of the time they are beyond far fewer of us than we ourselves imagine. Lots of people say, oh, I can't write poetry, or also, and this is an important response and perhaps an inhibitor on responses to this very paper, people say, I don't get poetry, I don't do poetry, I don't understand it, it doesn't do anything for me. I think more of us are capable actually of being influenced by poetry than we realise, and there's a kind of inhibition in people's minds that come here. I don't know from where, perhaps from the ways in which poetry is badly taught. But we can teach other the kind of still attentiveness and the capacity for awe that is necessary to be someone who is receptive to epiphanies. We can teach that. I don't want to say that the capacity for epiphanies is purely something that comes by nurture and not something that comes by nature, because it's very evident, and of course the poets of the 19th century, like Wordsworth and people like Dickens, are very keen on the fact that children often have a keener eye for epiphanies and a keener sensitivity to them than grown-ups do. There's another paper where I go on about that called The Eyes of a Child, which is about Dickens, on characters like he describes in Hard Times and Oliver Twist and David Copperfield and elsewhere, who have this childlike ability to see the epiphanic and respond to it. So I'm going to close with a disanalogy, which is a disanalogy between virtue and epiphany. Teaching virtue is teaching something for which people are praised or blamed. If they lack it, they're blamed. If they have it, they're praised. Teaching people the capacity for epiphanies is probably not going to be praised or blamed in something like the same way. I mean, if someone is just insensitive to an epiphany, then we won't say, oh, bad person, you're wrong, you're responding wrongly to this. Nor should we. I don't want to suggest that we should say that. But I do want to suggest that often the things that we think are wrong, like people's incapacity to see the humanity of others, for example, I think it might be more fruitful to think about that along the lines that I'm suggesting, the ways in which we talk about failures to grasp epiphany, and we want to say to other people, well, look more carefully, look more closely, think about this, take a moment, step back, take a breath, see if you really can't get a grip on this if you try. And also to point out to people that sometimes they have got a grip on this. So the disanalogy between virtue and epiphany there is that praise and blame is closely involved with virtue and failures in virtue. Praise and blame seems less natural when we're talking about grasping of epiphanies or not grasping them. But I want to say that actually the two cases are not as disanalogous as they might look. And here's a slightly distressing example to try and bring that out. You might remember the name Alan Kurdi. Alan Kurdi was a small refugee child, barely more than a toddler, who washed up dead on a beach in the south of England. And there was just a moment where even the Daily Express, even the Daily Mail, was capable of seeing the epiphanic value of this event. And when I say epiphanic here, go back to the definition that I give you, often the correct response is love, pity, creativity. It might also be anger or a hunger to put things right, a hunger for justice. Epiphanies can be epiphanies of the morally appalling. And I want to suggest that the death of a innocent refugee child on a beach like that is morally appalling. I want to suggest too that this is something which we should, in a sense, just see. It should be immediately available to us that that is a terrible thing to happen and that things must have gone catastrophically wrong in all sorts of ways if that is happening. And even the Daily Express and the Daily Mail could see this for a day or two, and then we switched back into othering mode and exclusion mode. So I want to suggest that the aesthetic mode of experience of the world sometimes makes good sense of the moral. That was one analogy or disanalogy between teaching epiphanies and teaching virtue. The other is my point about fishing. When you're teaching virtue, you are trying actively to make yourself a certain kind of person, and that ought to be under your control. And the more it's under your control, the better. With epiphanies, what is entirely under your control is actually the training in the relevant virtues of attentiveness, stillness, contemplativeness, reflectiveness, ability to get outside your own head, resistance to the fat, relentless ego, in Murdoch's phrase. Those kinds of things, that should be under your control. You do need to control yourself, to learn to control yourself better in those respects. But learning epiphanies is, as I say, with this Isaac Walton comparison, it's learning an aptitude to be ready for things which might or might not come along, might or might not come your way. You hope they will, but you can't guarantee that they will. All you can do is learn patience and learn to wait and learn to hope. And that, I think, is simply how it is for us. We would love these things to come our way. We would love the beautiful experiences, the beautiful epiphanies, at any rate, to come our way. And we would like to respond correctly when the horrifying experiences come our way, like the Alan Kurdi case. So we hope that we will learn that kind of responsiveness. Learning the responsiveness is, insofar as it's learning virtues, is learning something that we can control. What isn't under our control is whether the epiphanies will actually come to us. And on that, I want to suggest that we just have to resign ourselves to the world being that way. Before I called the book Epiphanies, I called it Grace in the World, because there's a wonderful verse in the Gospel of St. John that says, the Spirit blows where it wills, and you cannot control it. And that's a picture of, within the theological framework of God's grace in the world, to come back to Augustine, I think Augustine's right. As a Christian, I believe in grace. I think Augustine's right that humans cannot predict or control the grace of God. I disagree with Augustine about the consequences of that grace, because I think grace comes to us all in one way or another, and saving grace is available in the end for everybody. So God is not someone who just arbitrarily withholds his love from some and lets them go to hell. But what is true is that grace is ineffable and grace is unpredictable. And it's like that with Epiphanies too, which is why before it was called Epiphanies, it was called Grace in the World, because it's unpredictable. And so I want to close 10 minutes later than I intended to, but never mind. Not all good things are controllable, with some lines from another poet, another London Welsh poet, whom I began with, namely Gerard Manley Hopkins, which sums up what I want to say about the uncontrollable aspect of the learning of Epiphanies. I kiss my hand to the stars, lovely asunder starlight, wafting him out of it, and glow, glory and thunder. Kiss my hand to the dappled with damson west, since though he is under the world's splendour and wonder, his mystery must be stressed. For I greet him the days I meet him, and bless when I understand. Thank you.